When Ethan moved into his dream Brooklyn brownstone apartment, life finally felt stable. But every morning, no matter how carefully he locked it, his bedroom window was found unlocked. At first, it seemed like a small mystery until his camera captured the locks sliding open on their own at 2:47 a.m. What began as a nightly intrusion soon escalated into something far darker and far closer than he ever imagined. Hello everyone, welcome back. Tonight's story is a terrifying one that will make you double-check your windows before going to sleep. But before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments below. Alright, let's begin the story.
The apartment on the third floor of a pre-war brownstone in Brooklyn was a classic New York City find. High ceilings, hardwood floors that groaned with every step, and large windows that looked out onto a quiet, tree-lined street. For Ethan, a young architect, it was a dream. He had moved there for the space and the light, a welcome change from the cramped studio he had occupied for years. He meticulously arranged his furniture, set up his drafting table by the window, and settled into a life of predictable, quiet solitude. The first strange occurrence was so subtle he almost missed it. He was a creature of habit, and his morning ritual never varied. He would wake up, get a cup of coffee, and then go to his bedroom window to look at the street below. One morning, as he opened the blinds, he noticed his window was unlocked. He distinctly remembered locking it the night before. He was a stickler for security, a habit ingrained from years of city living. He shook his head, thinking he must have been tired, and locked it again. It happened the next day, and the day after that. Every morning, without fail, the window would be unlocked. He started to take it more seriously. He would double-check the lock before getting into bed. He would even take a picture of it with his phone, the lock firmly in place, the brass bolt slid securely into the frame. In the morning, he would check the photo and then look at the window. The photo would show the window locked, the window would be unlocked. He couldn't explain it. He was a rational man, a man who believed in cause and effect. He considered every possibility. Was it a draft? A faulty lock? He took the lock apart, cleaned it, and reassembled it. It worked perfectly. He even installed a secondary lock, a simple latch at the top of the window frame. He would lock both of them, and in the morning, both would be unlocked. It was a maddening, impossible reality. The feeling of dread began to seep into his life. He was no longer just annoyed, he was terrified. Someone or something was in his room every night. He couldn't shake the image of a gaunt, shadowy figure standing by his bed watching him sleep. He had no proof, no other evidence of an intrusion. The apartment was pristine in the morning. Nothing moved, nothing missing, just the open window. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one that he placed on his dresser, pointing directly at the window. He was so nervous that night he barely slept, waking up at every creak of the floorboards. In the morning, he checked the camera. The video showed him getting into bed, the room falling silent. He fast-forwarded through the footage, watching himself sleeping peacefully. Then, at 2:47 a.m., he saw it. The camera's red light flickered on, the window was in the frame, and he saw, with a gut-wrenching certainty, the lock on the top latch slowly, silently slide out of place. A moment later, the main lock followed, the brass bolt retracting with an almost imperceptible click. The window itself did not move. It was as if an invisible hand had reached out and unlocked it. He watched, his heart pounding as the video continued. Nothing else happened. The room was still. The camera's light turned off and the video ended a few seconds later. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had proof. There was a presence in his room, an entity that was not human that was unlocking his window every night. But why? What did it want? He looked at the video again, searching for any other sign, any other clue, but there was nothing. The room was a tableau of perfect silence and stillness. Just a window, unlocking itself. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable to an invisible intruder, was too much to bear. He called his landlord, told him he was breaking his lease, and began packing his belongings. He didn't tell his friends or family why. He didn't want to sound crazy. How could he explain that he was leaving his dream apartment because a ghost was unlocking his window. He found a new place, a modern high-rise in a different part of the city. The windows were new, made of reinforced glass, and the locks were mechanical marvels. He felt a sense of relief as he settled in, a feeling of security that he hadn't known in weeks. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening, before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first week was peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible film of dust on his nightstand. He wiped it away, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was as if someone had run a single, ghostly finger over the surface of the wood. Then, he found something in his bed. A small, black feather. It was impossibly thin, almost like a piece of ash, and it was nestled in his sheets, right by his pillow. He picked it up, his hand trembling. It didn't look like any feather he had ever seen. It was a cold, alien object. He was losing his mind. He was trying to find a rational explanation for irrational events. He was back in the same cycle of fear, the same cycle of disbelief. He went to the old apartment. The window was locked, just as he had left it. He looked up at his old room, at the large, beautiful window, a window that had become a source of profound terror. He wondered if his replacement had noticed the unlocked window in the morning. He decided to do more research. He went to the local historical society, a musty old building filled with the memories of the city. He looked through old records of his brownstone, tracing its history back to the 1800s. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper. A young boy, a child named Edward, had lived in the building in the late 1800s. The boy was an insomniac, a child who would stay up all night, sketching in his notebook, his mind filled with fantastic, impossible creatures. The boy had an obsession with the window. He would open it every night, regardless of the weather, and stare out into the darkness, claiming he was watching for something that was coming for him. The article ended abruptly, mentioning that the boy had died in his sleep, a sudden, unexplained illness. The last person to see him had said that he had insisted on his window being left unlocked, a plea that his parents had ignored. Leo felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. The boy's room. It was his old bedroom. The boy had been looking for something, a creature from his drawings, and he had believed that leaving the window unlocked was his only hope. He had died, and the window was locked. But what if the thing he was waiting for had finally come for him? And what if, in death, he was still waiting, still trying to open the window to let it in? He went home, his mind a feverish blur of fear and understanding. He looked at his modern, secure windows. He had left the old apartment, but the memory, the terror, the presence had followed him. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair, watching the sunrise, a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. The next morning, he went to his bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the window. It was closed. He looked at the lock. It was locked. He felt a profound sense of relief. But then he saw it. A single, small, black feather on the windowsill. The same cold, impossible feather he had found in his bed. It wasn't just his old apartment that was haunted. He was. The entity, the thing Edward had been waiting for, had found him. It wasn't coming in through the window. It was already in. He called a locksmith, a friend of his who specialized in antique locks. He had a strange request. He wanted him to install an old, complicated, beautiful lock on his modern window. He wanted a lock that would be a challenge, a lock that would require skill and care to open. His friend, curious, asked him why. Leo just said he had a fascination with old mechanisms. The lock was installed. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a brass lock with a complex series of tumblers and bolts. It was a statement, a challenge to the invisible intruder. He went to bed that night, a single black feather on his bedside table, a silent promise. He wasn't going to run anymore. He woke up with a start. The clock on his nightstand read 2:47 a.m. He looked at the window. It was still locked. He looked at his nightstand. The feather was gone. He felt a deep, profound sense of terror. It was no longer a game of unlocking windows. It was a game of possession. The entity was in his home, in his life, and it was moving his things, taunting him. The terror was no longer a silent presence. It was an active force. He spent the next few months living in a constant state of fear. He would come home to find objects moved, his keys on a different hook, his books in a different order. He would find these small black feathers in the most impossible places, in his coffee mug, in his shoe, in his pocket. The entity was toying with him, making him question his sanity. He would find notes on his computer, notes he didn't write, notes that said, "I'm here." He couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront it. He was a rational man, but he was at the end of his rope. He would do the impossible. He would leave his window unlocked. He would invite it in. He would face it. That night, he went to his bedroom window, his hands shaking, and he unlocked the intricate brass lock. He did the same to the old-fashioned latch on the top. He left the window open, just a crack, a silent invitation. He got into bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't close his eyes. He waited. He waited for the cold, the shadow, the presence. He waited for the feather to appear. He waited for what felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. The sun began to rise, casting a pale glow into his room. He was exhausted, but he had no fear. He looked at his window. It was still unlocked. He looked at his nightstand. There were no feathers. He felt a profound sense of confusion. Had it all been a dream? Had he gone crazy? He got out of bed, a new question in his mind. Not why was his window unlocked, but why was it no longer unlocked? He walked over to the window, his mind racing. He looked out at the street below, at the people walking to work, at the world that was moving on without him. He looked at the window, and he saw a note. A small piece of paper, folded into a perfect square, was stuck to the glass. He opened the window and grabbed the note. It said, "It's too late. I'm already inside." He didn't run. He just stood there, the note in his hand, looking at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man who had lost his mind, a man who had invited a ghost into his home. He looked at his reflection, and he saw a single, small, black feather in his hair. He looked at the note in his hand, and he felt a single, slow knock on the back of his head. A knock that he knew was not the wind, not a neighbor, not the house settling. It was the last goodbye. It was the last time he would ever feel alone. The doorbell that only rang at 3:15 a.m. The house on Sycamore Street, in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, was a perfect blend of modern comfort and classic charm. Its white picket fence, a meticulously manicured lawn, and a sleek gray exterior were a welcome sight for Julia, a successful software engineer. She had just bought the house, a single story with a sunroom that overlooked the mountains, and it was everything she had worked for. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the house, with its smart locks and automated lighting, felt like an extension of her own organized life. The first few weeks were idyllic. She spent her evenings in the sunroom, watching the sunset, her days filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life well earned. The house was calm, a haven of peace, until the night the doorbell rang. It was 3:15 a.m. Julia was a light sleeper, and the sound of the chime, a classic ding-dong that echoed through the silent house, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Who would be at her door at this hour? She crept out of bed, her phone in her hand, and checked the security camera feed. Her porch was empty. No one. The motion sensor hadn't been triggered, and the camera log showed no activity. It was a phantom chime. She went to the front door, peered through the peephole, and saw only the dark, empty street. She went back to bed, her mind racing, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The next night, it happened again. 3:15 a.m. The same ding-dong. She sprang out of bed, checked the camera, and found nothing. This time, a cold dread replaced her initial surprise. This was not a fluke, it was a pattern. She started to dread the night, the clock ticking closer and closer to the appointed hour. She would sit up in bed, her eyes fixed on the digital display, waiting for the sound that was both impossible and terrifyingly real. She tried everything to stop it. She disabled the smart doorbell, unplugged the chime, and even went as far as to remove the button itself from the wall. The house was silent, dark, and empty. She went to bed, a profound sense of relief washing over her. she would finally get some rest. But at 3:15 a.m., the sound came again. It was faint this time, a ghostly echo of the chime, as if the sound itself had been imprinted on the house. It was not a physical sound. It was an auditory hallucination, a sound that was only for her. She began to spiral. The lack of sleep, combined with the psychological terror of the phantom chime, was taking its toll. Her work was suffering, her perfectly organized life was falling apart, and her friends started to notice her gaunt face and haunted eyes. She tried to tell them, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. My doorbell keeps ringing, but there's no one there. They suggested she was stressed, that she was imagining it, but she knew she wasn't. The fear was too real. She tried to fight back with logic. She bought a new, more advanced security system. She installed infrared cameras and motion sensors all around the perimeter of her house. She even set up a camera inside the house, pointing at the front door, hoping to catch some glimpse of the impossible. She went to bed that night, a single, determined thought in her mind. She would find an answer. At 3:15 a.m., the faint, ghostly ding-dong echoed through her room. She sprang out of bed, grabbed her tablet, and checked the security camera feed. The outside cameras were still, the street was empty, and the motion sensors showed no activity. She switched to the inside camera, and her blood ran cold. The camera showed her front door, perfectly still and unremarkable. But as she watched, she saw a faint indentation appear on the surface of the wood, a small, circular impression, as if an invisible finger were pressing the now absent doorbell button. It was a phantom touch, a contact that was only visible to the camera's eye. The indentation lingered for a moment and then faded. The phantom chime had been the sound of an invisible visitor, an impossible presence that was trying to get into her house. Julia's mind reeled. This was not a hallucination. This was real. She was being haunted. But why? What did it want? She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in on the circular indentation. It was a perfect circle, a small, silent ring of pressure on her door. It was a persistent, patient, and terrifying attempt to get her attention. She had lived in this house for weeks, and this thing had been there all along, waiting for the opportune moment, for the dead of night, to announce its presence. She couldn't stay. She put the house on the market, desperate to escape the phantom chime and the invisible visitor. She packed her belongings with a frantic energy, throwing things into boxes without care. She just needed to be out. She needed to be gone before the next night. The house sold quickly, and she moved into a high-rise apartment in the city, a place with a doorman and security cameras on every floor. She felt a profound sense of relief as she settled in. The city noise was a comforting blanket, a constant, predictable sound that kept the silence at bay. She slept soundly for a week, and then two. She started to believe she had escaped. But some things can't be escaped. Sometimes a haunting is not about a place, it's about a person. One night, she was having a restless dream. A dream of a long, dark hallway and a ringing sound in the distance. She woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:15 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. She heard a sound, a faint, impossible ding-dong. It was not coming from her doorbell, it was coming from inside her phone. A ghostly echo, a notification sound she had never heard before. She looked at her phone. There was a notification on her calendar. It said, "Time to open the door." Her mind went blank with terror. It had followed her. It had found her. It was not the house. It was her. The doorbell wasn't meant for the house. It was meant for her. It was a silent, persistent knock on her soul, a plea for her to let it in. She looked at the door of her apartment, a solid, modern, locked door. She imagined the circular indentation on the surface of the wood, the invisible finger pressing against it, patiently waiting for her to respond. She knew she couldn't run anymore. This wasn't a problem she could solve with technology or logic. This was something ancient, something that had found her for reasons she couldn't fathom. She had to face it. That night, she made a decision. She would open the door. She sat in a chair in her living room, her eyes fixed on the clock on her phone. She felt the coldness, the familiar dread. The clock ticked closer to 3:15 a.m. She took a deep breath. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the most logical thing to do was to face the impossible. 3:15 a.m. The sound came. The faint, ghostly ding-dong, a sound that was not in her ears but in her mind. She stood up, her legs shaking, and walked to her front door. She took a deep breath, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she unlocked the deadbolt. She turned the knob and slowly, deliberately, pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. The lights were on, the cameras were on, and there was no one there. She felt a profound sense of confusion. She had expected a gaunt figure, a shadow, a presence. But there was nothing. The doorbell didn't ring again. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the empty hallway. She closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in months. She had faced her fear, and it had vanished. She woke up the next morning, feeling a sense of peace and liberation she had never known. She thought about the phantom chime, about the ghost that had haunted her. It was over. She was free. But some things are not that simple. As she was getting ready for work, she noticed something strange on her left hand. On her ring finger, a small circular impression, a faint, ghostly bruise, as if an invisible ring had been pressed onto her skin. She tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't fade. It was a permanent mark, a silent souvenir of the night she had opened the door. She looked at her hand, and she felt a sudden, deep sense of understanding. It wasn't about a door. It was about a commitment. She had invited it in. She had accepted its presence. The doorbell was not a request to enter. It was a symbol of a promise. She had been chosen, and the phantom chime had been the sound of an unseen ceremony. She was now bound to the thing that had haunted her, a partner in a haunting she had no memory of. And sometimes, when she's alone and the city is quiet, she looks at her hand, at the faint, circular bruise, and she hears it, a soft, gentle knock. A knock that is not a chime, but a promise. A knock that has followed her and will continue to follow her for the rest of her life. She is not just a homeowner anymore. She is a bride to a ghost. And the phantom chime was the sound of her wedding bells. He woke up and realized someone had tucked him in. The small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of downtown Chicago was everything Alex needed. A cozy space, a view of the skyline, and the comforting anonymity of a bustling city. He was a creature of habit, a man who lived a solitary and predictable life. He worked long hours as a data analyst, and his evenings were a quiet rhythm of takeout, a good book, and a sound sleep. His bed was his sanctuary, a place of peace and rest after a long day of numbers and spreadsheets. He was a man who believed in facts, in data, and in the tangible world. The first time it happened, he woke up with a start, a familiar cold chill running through him. He was covered in a way he wasn't before. His comforter, which he always just pulled up to his waist, was now tucked neatly under his chin, the sides folded firmly under the mattress. It was a perfect, deliberate tuck. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the blinds were closed, and there was no one there. He told himself he had done it in his sleep, a weird, subconscious action. He was a single man. There was no other explanation. He was just tired. He pulled the covers off, untucked the corners, and went back to sleep. The next morning, it happened again. The comforter was tucked neatly under his chin, the sides firmly secured. This time, he was more than just confused. He was unsettled. He lived alone. The door was locked, the windows were sealed. He had no pets. He spent the entire day at work in a state of unease, his mind replaying the image of the perfectly tucked blanket. He couldn't shake the feeling of an unseen presence in his bedroom. That night, he decided to do something about it. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one, and placed it on his nightstand, pointing directly at his bed. He wanted proof. He wanted to see himself in the middle of the night, tucking himself in like a child. He went to bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't sleep well. He woke up at every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, convinced he would catch the culprit in the act. But he never saw anything. In the morning, he checked the camera footage. He fast-forwarded through the video, watching his sleeping form, the slow rise and fall of his chest. He watched for hours, his eyes glued to the screen. At 3:17 a.m., the camera's red light flickered on. He was sleeping soundly. The blanket was just over his waist, as he had left it. Then he saw it. A faint shadow, a fleeting ripple of air, seemed to pass over his bed. The comforter, without a single visible hand to guide it, slowly began to move. The sides folded under the mattress, a perfect tuck. The top of the comforter was pulled up, just to his chin. The motion was slow, deliberate, and silent. There was no one there. Just a shadow, a presence, a force that was tucking him in. Alex's breath hitched in his throat. He went back to the footage, watched it again and again, hoping it was a glitch, a trick of the light. But it wasn't. The motion was too fluid, too purposeful. It was an entity, a thing that was entering his room, not to scare him, not to harm him, but to perform a quiet domestic act. It was tucking him in. The terror of a monster was replaced by a more insidious, a more profound kind of fear. The fear of something that was a part of his life. A silent, unseen companion that watched him sleep and cared for him in its own chilling way. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched was too much to bear. He didn't tell his friends or family why he was moving. How could he explain that he was leaving his home because a ghost was tucking him in? He found a new place, a modern building with a doorman, a place where he was sure no one could get in. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first few nights were peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible circular impression on his pillow, as if a head had been rested there. He dismissed it, a crease in the pillowcase. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was a silent message. A new kind of tuck. He began to research the history of his old apartment building. He went to the city archives, poring over old documents and newspaper clippings. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper in the 1920s. A woman named Clara had lived in his old apartment. She was an elderly seamstress who lived alone. She was known for her kindness and her love of her small, cozy home. The article mentioned that she had died in her sleep, a peaceful death. The last person to see her had said that she had a strange habit of tucking in her guests even when they were asleep. She believed it was a way of showing care, a quiet, gentle act of love. Alex felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. Clara, the seamstress who had lived in his apartment, she hadn't left. She was still there, in the quiet, empty space, performing her small act of care. She wasn't a monster. She was a ghost who had chosen him, a lonely ghost who was just trying to be a good host. The thought was somehow more terrifying than any demon or ghoul. The ghost of a lonely seamstress who wanted to be his friend. He couldn't go back to the old apartment. He had left her. He had abandoned her. Her simple, kind act of tucking him in. He felt a profound sense of guilt. He had feared her, run from her, when all she had wanted was to care for him. He sat in his new, modern apartment, a city of millions around him, and felt more alone than ever before. He thought of Clara, of the lonely ghost in the old apartment, still waiting, still watching. He decided to go back. He had to. He had to apologize. He had to let her know he wasn't afraid. He went to the old building, a key in his pocket that he had never returned. He went up the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He unlocked the door to his old apartment, and he walked in. The apartment was empty, cold, and quiet. He went to his old bedroom, the place where the tucking had happened. The room was just as he had left it, the bed stripped bare. He went to his old nightstand, the place where he had put the camera. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and he spoke. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered into the empty room. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." The air grew heavy. The scent of lavender, faint and old, filled the room. He felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. The cold was gone. The fear was gone. He felt a gentle, loving presence. He didn't know if she was there, but he knew she had heard him. He had finally given her the acknowledgement she had so desperately sought. He had apologized, He left the apartment, closing the door behind him, and he didn't look back. He felt a sense of closure, of peace. He had done the right thing. He had faced his fear, and he had found a kind of forgiveness. He was a man who had been haunted, and now he was a man who was free. He went back to his new apartment, to his new life, and for the first time in a very long time, he slept soundly. He was no longer afraid of the dark or of the quiet. He was no longer afraid of being alone. He had faced his greatest fear, and he had found a kind of love in it. But some things are not that simple. The next morning, he woke up with a start. The comforter was tucked neatly under his chin, the sides folded firmly under the mattress. It was a perfect, deliberate tuck. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the blinds were closed, and there was no one there. He looked at the comforter, at the perfect, impossible tuck. The ghost of Clara had followed him. She hadn't wanted to be left behind. She was still with him, in his new apartment, in his new life, a silent, unseen companion. The fear returned, a familiar, cold dread. He had apologized. He had tried to be a good man. But he had been a man who had been chosen, and a ghost who has chosen you will never let you go. The quiet, gentle terror of the tucking would be a part of his life forever. The tucking was a daily occurrence now. It became part of his routine. He would go to bed, leave his covers untucked, and in the morning they would be perfectly folded. It was a constant, unsettling reminder of his unseen companion. He no longer felt fear, but a weary acceptance. It was a part of his life, a strange, impossible roommate. He would find other small signs of her presence. The faint scent of lavender when he walked into his bedroom, a single loose thread on his pillowcase, as if she were a seamstress still at work. He tried to live a normal life, but the secret of his nocturnal visitor was a heavy weight on his soul. He started to talk to her. He would lie in bed in the dark and whisper into the silence. He would tell her about his day, about his work, about the new coffee shop he had found. It was a strange, one-sided conversation, but he felt a sense of connection, a strange companionship with the ghost of a lonely seamstress. He wasn't just a man who was haunted. He was a man who was no longer alone. But the companionship was not without its own brand of terror. Sometimes he would wake up, and the blankets would not be tucked. Instead, they would be pulled down to his feet, and he would feel a cold, icy presence on his chest. It was a new kind of tuck, a new kind of terror. It was a warning, a reminder that she was not just a kind old woman, she was a ghost. And ghosts are not always kind. One morning, he woke up, and he was not just tucked in. He was wrapped tightly in the blanket, his arms and legs bound to his body. He struggled to get free, his heart pounding with a primal, suffocating fear. He heard a soft whisper, a voice that was not in his ears, but in his mind. "Stay a while. I'm lonely." He finally managed to get free, his body shaking with terror. The blankets were perfectly wrapped, a tight, impossible cocoon. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, and he saw a man who was no longer just a tenant. He was a possession. Clara was not just a companion, she was a captor. He fled the apartment, ran out into the city streets, a man who had lost his mind. He found a friend, a man who had always been a skeptic, and he told him everything. The ghost, the tucking, the whispers. His friend listened, his face a mask of concern. He tried to be supportive, but the look in his eyes told a different story. He believed that his friend had gone crazy. Alex knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't go back to the apartment, to the woman who was trying to love him to death. He lived on the streets for a week, sleeping in parks and bus stations, a man with no home, no peace, no sanity. He was a fugitive from a ghost. One night, he was huddled in an alley, the cold Chicago wind biting at his skin. He felt a soft hand on his shoulder. He looked up, and he saw a woman. She was an old woman with a kind face and gentle eyes. She was holding a blanket. "You must be cold," she said, her voice soft and full of concern. She put the blanket around him, and gently, carefully, she tucked him in. He looked at her, and he saw a face that was both familiar and alien. It was the face of Clara. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman smiled, a kind, loving smile. She sat down next to him, and she began to talk. She told him about her life, about her home, about her love for her work. She talked, and he listened. A man who was no longer alone, he was with his ghost. She had followed him, she had found him, she had never let him go. The tucking was not just a gesture of care, it was a shackle, a promise that he would be hers forever. She checked her phone footage and saw herself awake. The small apartment in Austin, Texas, was a testament to Amelia's love for order. Every book on the shelf was alphabetized, the throw pillows on the couch were always perfectly fluffed, and the kitchen counters were perpetually clear. Her life was a carefully curated sequence of events, a calm and predictable rhythm. She was a freelance graphic designer, and her days were spent in the quiet company of her monitor, a cup of green tea, and her dog, a sleepy beagle named Barnaby. Her nights were a different story. For the past few weeks, sleep had become her enemy. She would wake up in the middle of the night, a profound and unsettling chill running through her, with no memory of what had disturbed her. The first few times, she dismissed it. A bad dream, a strange noise from a neighbor, the natural restlessness of a person under a bit of stress, but it started to happen every night. Always around 3:00 a.m. She would sit up in bed, wide awake, her heart pounding, her mind a blank slate. The strange awakenings started to take their toll. She was perpetually exhausted, her focus at work was suffering, and the lines of her carefully ordered life were beginning to blur. Her friends joked that she needed a sleep mask and some lavender oil. Her doctor suggested a change in diet and more exercise. Nothing worked. The sense of profound unease persisted, a cold, sharp dread that would hit her the moment her eyes opened in the pre-dawn darkness. One morning, she woke up with an idea. It was born of desperation and a need for proof. She would record herself sleeping. It was a simple solution. She would set up her phone on a small tripod at the foot of her bed, start the video recording, and in the morning, she would have her answers. Maybe she snored. Maybe she thrashed around in her sleep. Maybe a neighbor's loud music was the culprit. Anything was better than the quiet, terrifying unknown. The first night, she set up the phone, pressed record, and climbed into bed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and foolishness. She fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion finally winning the battle. She woke up at 3:07 a.m., just a few minutes later than her usual time. The same icy dread washed over her. She got up, stopped the recording, and went back to sleep, her mind filled with a faint sense of disappointment that she had woken up again. The next morning, with a cup of coffee in hand, she sat down at her desk to watch the video. She fast-forwarded through the footage, watching her sleeping form, seeing the steady rise and fall of her chest, Barnaby curled up at her feet. She skipped ahead to the 3:00 a.m. mark. She watched herself stir in her sleep, her body tensing, and then her eyes snapped open, just as she remembered. She sat up in bed, her face a mask of fear. She watched herself look around the room, her head slowly turning from side to side. Then, she saw something else on the screen, something she hadn't seen in the moment. In the background of the shot, just by the open closet door, a shadow seemed to deepen. It was an unnatural movement, a thickening of the darkness. It was slow and deliberate, like someone stepping out from the shadows. She froze, a cold shiver racing down her spine. The figure was gaunt, tall, and dressed in a long dark coat. Its hands were impossibly long, the fingers like spidery branches. It took a step out of the closet and stood there, motionless, watching her sleeping form. The Amelia on the screen was looking at it now. She saw her head turn, her gaze fixed on the closet. But she didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there, a blank, terrified expression on her face, watching the thing in the darkness. The figure in the coat raised one of its long arms, and slowly, gently, it waved. A single, slow motion, like a farewell. Then it simply faded into the darkness, the space where it had been returning to normal. Just as the figure vanished, the Amelia on the screen shuddered, and her eyes, now filled with tears, looked down at her lap. A few seconds later, she reached for her phone, and the video ended. Amelia's mind was reeling. This was not a nightmare. This was real. She was not waking up on her own. Something was waking her up. Something that was waiting in her closet, watching her. She didn't know what it was. She didn't want to. She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in. The image was grainy, but the features were undeniable. The gaunt face, the impossibly long limbs, the dark coat, it was a thing of nightmares, come to life in her quiet, orderly apartment. She tried to rationalize it. A glitch in the camera? A trick of the light? But the movement was too fluid, too purposeful. It waved at her. She watched the motion again and again, her stomach churning with nausea and dread. She called a friend, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. "I saw a monster on my phone," she said, her voice cracking. Her friend tried to be supportive, but she could hear the confusion and concern in her tone. She spent the next few days in a fog of fear. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't work. The fear was a constant, heavy presence. She went to the police. They listened patiently, their faces a mix of politeness and skepticism. They suggested she see a counselor. They told her there were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of anything amiss. She was on her own. She decided to try the video again. She knew it was a terrible idea, but the need for answers was a powerful and dangerous force. She was a woman who needed to understand, to organize, to label. The unknown was her greatest fear. She set up the phone again, her hands shaking, and got into bed, leaving a small lamp on this time. She couldn't bear to be in total darkness. She fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams a chaotic jumble of shadowy figures and long, spidery hands. She woke up, as always, at 3:00 a.m. Her eyes opened, and she felt the now familiar chill. She looked at the closet door. It was closed. She felt a brief moment of relief. Then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from inside her closet. A slow, gentle tapping, as if something were drumming its fingers on the back of the door. The sound was not loud, but it was so deliberate, so unnatural, that it was 1,000 times more terrifying than a scream. She watched the closet door, her eyes wide with fear. The tapping stopped. Then she heard a faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the floor, just beneath the door. She watched as a small, thin, black object slid out from under the door. It was a piece of paper, folded into a perfect square. It was pushed all the way out into the middle of the floor, and then the scratching sound stopped. She was too terrified to move, to breathe. She waited until the first light of dawn broke through her window. The terror had given way to a quiet, cold determination. She got out of bed, her body stiff with fear. She went to the paper and picked it up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unfold it. Inside, there was a single sentence, written in a spidery, unsettling script. "I miss our conversations." Her mind went blank. Conversations? What conversations? She didn't remember any conversations with a shadowy figure. The thought was horrifying. She had been awake. The video had shown her. But she had no memory of it. The thing in her closet was waking her up and speaking to her, and then somehow making her forget. It was more than a presence. It was a parasitic memory, a dark companion that was slowly, patiently stealing her waking hours. She ran. She didn't pack anything. She grabbed Barnaby, her keys, and her wallet, and she ran out of the apartment. She didn't stop to call anyone. She drove to the nearest motel, checked in, and sat on the bed in the middle of a brightly lit room, her phone footage playing on a loop. She watched herself, her sleeping self, a quiet, unsuspecting prey, and she watched the shadowy figure, a patient predator, waiting for her to wake up. She never went back to the apartment. She abandoned her furniture, her belongings, her carefully curated life. She moved to a new city, a place with a different time zone, where 3:00 a.m. was not 3:00 a.m. anymore. She installed security cameras throughout her new apartment, and she never, ever slept with her closet door closed. She started therapy, a long, difficult process of trying to understand the gaps in her memory and the nature of the fear that had become a constant companion. She learned about dissociative amnesia, about the mind's way of protecting itself from trauma, but she knew this wasn't just a psychological break. It was something else. Months turned into a year. She was beginning to heal. She had a new job, new friends, a new rhythm. The terror had receded, replaced by a quiet, lingering vigilance. The memory of the figure in the coat was a dull ache in the back of her mind, a scar from a wound that would never fully close. She still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, a cold dread in her stomach, But she would check her phone, the time would be a random number, and the fear would subside. She told herself she was okay. She told herself she was safe. Then, one night, she was having a restless dream. A dream of a long, dark hallway and a gaunt figure waiting at the end. She woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:00 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. Barnaby, who was sleeping at the foot of her bed, suddenly sat up, his ears twitching, and he began to growl, a low, guttural sound. He was looking at the closet door. It was closed. A single, small piece of paper slid out from under the door, unfolding as it went. It was a perfect square. It came to rest in the middle of her floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Barnaby, and he was still growling, his eyes fixed on the paper. She was terrified, but a new feeling, a feeling she hadn't known before, was rising within her. It was a cold, quiet anger. This thing had stolen her peace, her home, her memories. It had chased her across states. She wasn't going to run anymore. She got out of bed, her legs trembling, but her resolve firm. She walked over to the paper, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she picked it up. She unfolded it and read the words, written in that same spidery, unsettling script. "You can't outrun me." She looked at the closet door. "I know," she whispered into the darkness, her voice filled with a strange new power. She crumpled the paper in her hand and threw it in the trash. She went back to her bed and lay down, her heart still pounding, but the fear was different now. It was no longer a terror that paralyzed her. It was a challenge. She had been a victim for too long. She had been running. But what would happen if she stood still? She didn't know. But she was finally willing to find out. She would stay in this apartment, she would find out what this thing was, what it wanted, and she would fight it. She wasn't going to let it steal another minute of her life. She looked at her phone, at her reflection in the dark screen. The woman staring back at her was still afraid. But she was no longer just a victim. She was a warrior. And for the first time in a very long time, she was finally home. She wasn't going to let the shadows win. The stranger who sat at the edge of her bed and vanished. The old farmhouse, set deep in the rolling hills of rural Ohio, was everything Eleanor had ever wanted. A wraparound porch for drinking coffee at sunrise, a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth on cold nights, and a sky so dark with no city lights that the stars looked like a spilled handful of diamonds. She had moved there to escape the relentless noise of her life, to find a stillness she hadn't known since childhood. For a year, the house was her sanctuary. Its creaks and groans were the comfortable sounds of a living, breathing structure. The silence was a blanket she could wrap herself in. Then, the quiet changed. It was subtle at first. A feeling of being watched when she was alone in the kitchen. A cold draft in the hallway, even with every window sealed tight. She brushed it off as an overactive imagination, a side effect of living so far from civilization. She told herself it was just the isolation settling in. But then, one night, she woke up with a start. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Sitting at the very edge of her bed, his back to her, was a figure. A man. His posture was slumped, his shoulders bowed, as if the weight of the world was resting on them. He was dressed in what looked like an old, dark suit, frayed at the cuffs, and he was completely still. Eleanor was frozen, a statue of pure terror. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. Her mind raced, grappling with the impossible reality. How did he get in? The doors were locked. The windows were secured. She didn't own a dog, so there was no alarm to be triggered. He was just there. She squeezed her eyes shut and then opened them again. He was still there. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where sound should be. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a hummingbird trapped in her chest. She watched the figure, her eyes trying to make out his features, but he was just a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. She could feel his presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air. He wasn't breathing, not in a way a living person would. There was no rise and fall of his shoulders, just a desolate, unmoving stillness. After what felt like an eternity, he began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one hand and rested it on the bed, just beside his leg. The fabric of the comforter didn't shift, but she felt a sudden, profound coldness radiating from the spot. It was like touching frozen steel. Then, just as slowly, he began to turn his head. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could see the profile of his face now. It was thin, gaunt, with an unnerving hollow where his eyes should have been. The other side of his face was lost in shadow. He was turning, slowly, agonizingly, to look at her. She felt an overwhelming dread, a primal fear that had nothing to do with a home invader and everything to do with something ancient and wrong. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was not a person. He was facing her now. She could not see his eyes in the gloom, but she felt them. 2 pinpricks of icy malice piercing through the darkness. A shiver of pure dread ran from the top of her head down to her toes. Then she saw his mouth. A long, thin line that curled up into a slow, deliberate, grotesque smile. The smile was not one of mirth or greeting. It was the smile of a predator, of a thing that had found its prey. And just as she felt the scream tear its way up her throat, the figure vanished. Not faded, not dissolved into mist, he simply ceased to be. One moment he was there, a solid form on the edge of her bed, and the next the space was empty. The cold spot on the comforter was gone. The heavy, oppressive feeling in the room lifted, replaced by the familiar, comforting quiet of her farmhouse. But the quiet was no longer a blanket. It was a shroud. She didn't sleep again that night, or the night after. The image of that gaunt face, that predatory smile, was seared into her mind. She tried to tell herself it was a waking dream, a hallucination brought on by stress, but the memory was too vivid, too real. She bought a new alarm system, installed motion-activated lights, and even got a large dog from the local shelter. She did everything she could to feel safe, but the feeling never returned. The man came back. Not every night, but randomly, sporadically. Sometimes a week would pass, and she would begin to think it was over. Then she'd wake up, a sudden, cold dread in her stomach, and see him again. Always at the same time, 3:17 a.m., always sitting at the edge of her bed, his back to her. He never spoke, never moved, except for that slow, terrifying turn. She stopped trying to scream. She just watched, paralyzed by fear, as he turned his head and gave her that awful, empty smile. She became a prisoner in her own home. She would stay up until 4:00 a.m. every night, drinking endless cups of coffee, trying to outlast the visitation. She would fall asleep in the armchair in the living room, with the lights on and the TV playing, but she would always wake up in her bed with a cold chill and the gnawing certainty that he had been there, that he had watched her, and then, at 3:17 a.m., had appeared to sit with her. She began to notice other things. Objects moved in her house, the books on her shelf would be out of order, a favorite teacup would be in the wrong cupboard. Her dog, a large and boisterous golden retriever, would often whimper and refuse to enter her bedroom after midnight. He would stand at the doorway, hackles raised, and growl at something Eleanor couldn't see. He saw him. She knew it. He saw the stranger. Desperate, she started researching the history of the house. She went to the local historical society, poring over brittle, yellowed documents. She found a story about the family who had built the house in the 1880s. The family, the Andersons, had a young son named Elias, who was an artist. He was known for his beautiful, unsettling portraits, particularly of a gaunt, shadowy figure he called the Watcher. He claimed the figure sat with him every night, watching him paint. The story ended abruptly. Elias was found dead in his bed, an expression of profound terror frozen on his face. The official cause of death was an unknown fever, but the town whispers